then let's actually talk about the biblical text. The first thing you want to try to determine when you are looking at a biblical book is who wrote it and for whom. Okay? And there are some clues that you can find in Mark. For instance, Mark 7, 3-4. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands, thus observing the traditions of the elders. Now, what can you learn about Mark's intended audience from that?
It was postulated that he may have not been writing to Jews because he explained, the Pharisees and the Jews.
Right. He seems to assume at least some Gentiles are going to be reading this. How do we know? Because he takes the time to explain these Jewish customs that you wouldn't have to explain if you were just writing to Jews. Now, it doesn't mean his audience is only going to be Gentiles. That may be the case, but you can't conclude that. But it means that he anticipates there will be at least some Gentiles who are going to be reading this. Okay, does that make sense? We see the same kind of thing here. He includes the Aramaic, aphatha, but then he translates it, be open, because he's assuming they're not going to know Aramaic. All right? Now this is interesting. Again, he went out from the region of Tyre and came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. Well, you just took a map quiz. What's curious about that? Well, here's Sea of Galilee. Where's Tyre? Here, where's Sidon? On up here. If you're going from here down to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, why in the world are you going up through Sidon? And we'll see a couple other instances where some have suggested Mark may not know his Palestinian geography very well. And in some places even where Matthew has changed it to be something that's more geographically appropriate. Now, it's possible, Jesus actually took this roundabout way because he wanted to go through Sidon for some reason. But it's just kind of curious because it seems odd. Mark 14, 51-52. A young man was following him. This is when Jesus is being arrested, wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body. And they seized him, but he pulled free of the linen sheet and escaped naked. All right? This is one of everybody's favorite passages. Curiously enough, it's only in Mark. The other gospel writers decided not to carry this part over. This guy doesn't show up anywhere before in Mark. He never is mentioned afterwards in Mark. And the big question is, why in the world is this in there? And so what some have suggested to make sense of this being in there is maybe that's Mark. Right? And that's why he puts it in there. And then they'll try to deduce socioeconomic status from the fact that he's wearing a linen sheet and go on from that. So that's possible. It's possible. One final thing to note. They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to bear his cross. Now, what do we learn about his audience from this? Okay. And what about Alexander and Rufus? I mean, do you know who they are? No, we don't have these, giant paeans of the faith, Alexander and Rufus from the early church. So why in the world are they being mentioned? I mean, it's not like, he's connecting them to Peter or Paul or James. It's Alexander and Rufus. Maybe they were, not necessarily though. I mean, he has a Greek name, but you can't necessarily, because we've seen the Maccabees took Greek names. It's just they were probably known to his community, to the people for whom he's writing. I mean, how many of you in sermons, you're talking about someone saying, "Oh, this is actually, Aunt Millie's, grandson." Right? Well, if you publish your sermon, nobody else is going to know who Aunt Millie is. But the people there know, right? You're making it personal. You're drawing it in and connecting it so that, oh yeah, I've got a connection to this story. which suggests that he's probably writing for a community that he knows, and he knows the people. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. Simon of Cyrene. Oh yeah, that's Rufus and Alexander's dad. Right? You know them. You know him. Right? Okay. All right. Well, let's look at how Mark begins his gospel. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, "Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying in the wilderness, make ready the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." All right, now where is this citation from? I heard from Isaiah. It's actually from Malachi. Oh, wait a minute. Now, why did you think it was from Isaiah? Because it says Isaiah, right? He's tricky, this Mark. Yeah, it's from Malachi 3:1. Now, he does eventually get to Isaiah. We got Isaiah 40, verse 3 down here. But it's not where he first starts. Well, did he just make a mistake? Some scribes thought so. They changed it to, as it is written in the prophets. That must be what he meant, because it's more than one, and it's not just Isaiah. That's not what he wrote. He put, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet. Well, this is something that Mark does a lot. In fact, so much so that it's often called a Markan sandwich. Okay, where you have a theme, and then you insert something else, and then you come back to the same theme. Okay? So here you've got reference to Isaiah, and slotted in between, you slip a little Malachi meat. Right? The question is why? Why is he putting this Malachi bit in here? All right? We'll come back to that question. But first I want to look at the Isaianic frame. It seems to be the driving thing, since that's what gets highlighted. Right? This is from Isaiah. What's going on in Isaiah 40? Think back to Old Testament. That's when Isaiah. No, they're not thinking in terms of Deutero and Trito and all of that. Comfort, O comfort my people. Right? Isaiah 40 presumes a people in exile, and it announces what? It announces that God is going to come and basically lead them in a new exodus. Okay, Isaiah 40 to 55. If you look at the handout that I gave you while you were taking your quiz, I'm going to start reading the first full paragraph on the left-hand side. The catalytic event is the summons to prepare a derrick for Yahweh, a way. And its prominence in the prologue indicates that the emphasis of the new Exodus lies on the return of Yahweh's actual presence. Without the coming of Yahweh, there can be no salvation. Thus, 40 verse 9, in response to 35 verse 4, the most important new Exodus chapter in 1 through 39, announces, "Behold your God." It is therefore the advent of Yahweh as a mighty warrior that inaugurates the deliverance of his people from their bondage among the nations. As he had once led them through the sea, so Yahweh will accompany them through the waters and the fire, again leading the glorious procession, being both front and rear guard in the cloud and in the fire. Yahweh will shepherd them, providing food and water in a miraculous transformation of the wilderness, and there will again be a revelation of his glory. As with the announcement of comfort, so too the goal of the new Exodus is centered on the presence of Yahweh, that is, his enthronement in a restored Jerusalem. Since Jerusalem is first and foremost Zion, the city of the great king, concern for the city is central and dominates both the prologue and the epilogue. The word of comfort in 41 and following culminates in a messenger announcing to Jerusalem the good news of her redemption and rebuilding. She will be reestablished in righteousness. She will know divine protection and vindication, and all her accusers will be overthrown. Yahweh will pour his spirit upon Jacob's offering, and they will glory in the Lord, being both taught and owned by him. On this reading, the prophet's message of deliverance presupposes both Israel's founding moment of redemption and an underlying three-part Exodus schema. A, Yahweh's deliverance of his exiled people from the power of Babylon and her idols. B, a journey along the way in which Yahweh leads his people from their exile to Jerusalem. And C, arrival in Jerusalem where Yahweh is enthroned in a gloriously restored Zion. Okay. In sum, the prophet presents the vision of Yahweh, who after smashing the powers of chaos and making a way in the wilderness, gently leads his flock home to Zion. Okay? So, according to Watts, if you read Isaiah 40 to 55, it lays out a three-part schema for how Yahweh is going to execute this new Exodus. What's the first phase? Deliverance, right? So first he comes in and he delivers them from the power of Babylon and her idols. All right, what's the second phase? Journey along the way in which Yahweh leads his people from their exile to Jerusalem. And by the way, what is John's message? How is he described? Prepare the way, right? In the wilderness. Wilderness is Exodus language. Okay? And then 3. Arrival in Jerusalem and then enthronement of Yahweh as king. Okay? This is basically an outline of Mark. Okay? Now, how does this work? Well, let's look at it. First, though, I would note Malachi 3:1, that little slip of meat that was put in the sandwich, is itself alluding back to Exodus traditions. Okay? So Mark, behold, I send my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. Malachi 3:1, behold, I send out my messenger and he will oversee the way ahead of me, which is alluding back to Exodus 23:20. Behold, I send my messenger ahead of you, so that he will guard you on the way, so as to bring you into the land that I prepared for you. Okay, so it's all tied up in this new Exodus imagery. All right, now again, we'll come back to the Malachi bit probably next week. But deliverance. Okay, this is the first main section. It's the theme of this section from 116 to 821. Okay. So you get Jesus liberating from demonic oppression. Well, let's look at Mark 5 for a second. They came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. Now, again, think about your map. You got the Sea of Galilee. Where's Gerasa? Way down here. Do you step off the boat into Gerasa? No, you don't. When Matthew tells this story, he changes it to Gadara, the region around Gadara. Well, yeah, Gadara is up there pretty close. And once you make it the region around, well, yeah, you can step off the boat. You've heard about the day when pigs flew? Well, they'd have to if they're going to jump, off the hill into the sea from Gerasa. When he had come out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. And constantly, night and day, among the tombs and in the mountains, he was crying out and gashing himself with stones. And seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What do I have to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you, by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And he was asking him, "What is your name?" And he said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he began to entreat him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there was a big herd of swine feeding there on the mountain, and the demons entreated him, saying, "Send us into the swine, so that we may enter them." And he gave them permission. And coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. And their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and out in the country, and the people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed, sitting down, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had had the legion, and they became frightened. Okay? Well, let's talk about this for a minute. What's the name of the demon? Legion. What kind of imagery does that name conjure up? Army, right? Why? What nation power was famous for having legions? Roman, right? It's a Roman military unit, right? Have you heard this story before? What do you have? You have God's people in an unclean place being oppressed by a foreign army, and God shows up and drowns that army in the sea. Someone said it. Exodus. It's Exodus. Jesus is initiating a new Exodus. Except it's not the Romans that he's leading them out from under. It's whom? The demonic powers. That's the occupying army he's come to set them free from. Does that make sense? Once you start to attune your mind to hear these echoes of Exodus, you find them all over the place. Right? So we see him, liberating from demonic oppression. He heals Israel and forgives their sins. He demonstrates his mastery over nature. And he provides miraculously where? In the wilderness. Can you think of another time when there was a group of people in the wilderness that were hungry and God fed them miraculously? Exodus. Right? That's the one miracle, by the way, that appears in all four Gospels. Right? All right. You may have noticed there were a lot of healings in the first 7 chapters. Jesus does a lot of miracles. Right? He casts out an unclean spirit. He heals Peter's mother's fever. He heals a leper, a paralytic, someone with a withered hand, a demoniac, Jairus' dead daughter, a hemorrhaging woman, a Syrophoenician daughter's unclean spirit, and someone who's deaf and dumb. All right. How many do we have? 10. Why 10? Probably not the 10 Commandments. Can you think of anybody else who came to set God's people free through 10 mighty acts of power? Moses. When he comes to lead them out in the Exodus. How funny that he would allude to that. Yeah, and notice none of these get repeated. I mean, there are a couple exorcisms, but the actual healings, it's different every time. Right? So he's portraying Jesus as the one who has come to lead his people out in a new Exodus. All right? All right, we'll cover this briefly and then stop here. Second section of Mark starts in Mark 8. 22 to 26. They came to Bethsaida, and they brought a blind man to him and entreated him to touch him. Taking the blind man by the hand, he brought him out of the village, and after spitting on his eyes and laying his hands upon him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, for I am seeing them like trees walking about." Then again he laid his hands upon his eyes, and he looked intently and was restored, and began to see everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." All right? What's curious about this passage? Yeah, it didn't take the first time. What in the world's up with that? Did Jesus just not eat his Wheaties that morning? Do you see anything, my son? Kind of. It's a little blurry. It's like trees walking around. Now do you see? Oh yeah, now it's clear. What's up with that? Why does it take 2 touches? Well, it's worth noting we get our first repeated healing at the end of the section that forms a kind of inclusio, bracketing off this second section. This is where Bartimaeus gets healed. He's a blind man on the road. What comes right after this? Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do you say that I am?" Or who do people say that I am? They told him, saying, John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others one of the prophets. He continued by questioning, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered and said to him, "Thou art the Christ." And he warned them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. If you want to see Jesus clearly, you have to get 2 touches. What's the first touch? Who do you say that I am? You're the Christ. Touch 1. But if that's all you know about Jesus, it's like seeing people as trees walking. What else? What's the second touch? What's the second piece that you've got to get if you want to understand Jesus?
Understand why he's going to go through things he's going to suffer.
Suffer. Yes, he's the Christ who has to suffer and die. That's the second touch. That's what will enable you to see him clearly. And until you grasp that point, and that's what he's going to hit, 8:30, 9:30, 10:30. He repeats it over and over again in this middle section. Son of Man has to suffer and die. What are you talking about? Right? Now, have you noticed that Jesus is forever telling them, what does he do after every healing? What does he tell the people? Yeah, shh, don't say anything. Right? I mean, that's the way we treat our congregants, right? When something amazing happens, shh, just make sure you don't tell anyone that good stuff's going on. Well, why does he do that? No, I think it's because he knows they don't really understand what's going on yet. And if all you have is that first touch and you start going, blabbing your mouth, explaining what you think's going on, what are you going to do? You're going to set people up with false expectations of what's about to happen, and they're just going to become disappointed, and it's going to serve to inoculate them against what Jesus is actually doing. Right? Does that make sense? That's why he says, wait until you understand. Then you can go to, how does Mark's gospel end? Angel says to the women, go and tell. No, I'm not going to do that now. Right? Everybody's been so anxious to speak. And then suddenly, okay, now you've got all the pieces. Now you can go tell. No, I'm not going to talk about that. That's not going to go over as well. Right? And they go away afraid. And the gospel ends just like the Sopranos, kind of fade to black. And everyone's like, wait, no, where's the end of the story? And so some people come along and try to supply it. And a couple endings get attached. Yeah, this whole middle section is about Jesus trying to heal their blindness so that they can see who he is truly. Because without that second touch, they're not equipped to be his evangelists. Does that make sense? All right. We'll pick up there next week.